So today we're going to be talking about algorithmic fairness in the context of SNAP and in particular throughout the whole kind of benefits pipeline. But to give a bit more context, what is SNAP? So in the US, SNAP is a program for low-income families that helps them purchase nutritious food. And in particular, this comes to them in the form of an EBT card, which effectively is a debit card that allows you to purchase groceries. And this is a massively impactful program, right? So something like 1 in 8 Americans use SNAP benefits. This has incredible short-term effects, right? If you just think about the massive hunger problem that we have in America, but also a bunch of long-term effects, right? With outcomes like education, health, broadly speaking, all improving on the basis of the SNAP program. So super impactful, but I also want to flag that it's just like a really complicated program, right? So the money for SNAP comes at the federal level, but it's actually implemented at a state-by-state level, right? So the folks who are making rules and coming up with these different logistical systems are all differing by state. And so if folks saw in the news recently with the last federal government shutdown, right, this is something that directly affected the SNAP program because that money came from the federal level. But of course, we also, again, have state-level logistics that are also changing over time. So if you think about EBT benefits, right, I mentioned they're kind of like a debit card, but then in the wake of COVID, increasingly more states joined pilot programs so that you could use your EBT benefits to purchase groceries online through Instacart, right? And more recently, there have been a lot of concerns about card skimming fraud. And for that reason, a few states, including New York State, announcing this very recently, as of last week, has announced a push to move from magnetic strips to chip cards. So point being, I just want to flag that SNAP logistics are constantly changing. Things are constantly going wrong or going right, and these are all different across different states. But not only is SNAP a very complicated program to run, it's also exceptionally complicated to use. So if you want to apply for SNAP benefits because you are living under the poverty line, the first question might be, how do you actually find out that you're eligible? And this comes from two directions, right? So one is, of course, there are community workers and state agencies and outreach providers who might be able to find you in your community and provide outreach and give you some sense of whether or not you would be eligible. On the flip side, you might also need to do your own research and figure out whether you're eligible. So more recently, for example, work eligibility requirements have changed. And so you might need to reevaluate whether you are eligible on the basis of news that you see. And this is a direct quote from the New York State guidelines, which is the only way to determine if your household is eligible for SNAP benefits is to apply. So this begs the question, how do you actually apply? And this in and of itself is also a massively long and convoluted process that involves things like submitting an application, going to a SNAP interview, submitting all of your documents for verification, or specifically the relevant documents for verification. And only then do you get your EBT card and are able to get your benefits. But of course, there's much, much more in this whole pipeline, like how do you actually functionally use your SNAP benefits? How do you report things like household changes or income changes or theft? Or how do you recertify benefits because they might only last from a month to 3 years, right? And of course, throughout this whole process, there is a lot of stigma against SNAP users. So a whole slew of places where I think a lot of folks could do more research. So this is my kind of pitch to the audience here, that hopefully folks will think about how their research could fit into different pieces of this pipeline. And today I'm just going to focus on the first 2 bits, and in particular, mapping those onto these 2 specific projects that I'll be talking about today. The first one on online advertising for SNAP benefits, and the second one on LLMs for caseworker assistance. So first half that I'll talk about is published in ICWSM from a few years ago, and the second one is work in progress. So we'll see how this goes, and very much welcome any feedback that you have. Okay, so starting with online ads. First, a big number. The average American sees a lot of ads per day. And this is relevant because when you apply for SNAP, as kind of mentioned before, the actual application process has historically been super long, convoluted, full of legalese, just kind of gross to look at, right, if you think about how messy these sorts of forms are. And so this is when a nonprofit called Code for America enters and creates this website called Get CalFresh. So point of clarification, like I mentioned, SNAP is different across different states. So SNAP in California is referred to as CalFresh. That's the name of the program. And so you can go to this website called getcalfresh.org, and it's this beautiful GUI, you can apply in 10 minutes. Everything is in simple, kind of easy to parse language. And it's just much more of a smooth process to apply for SNAP through a officially sanctioned website like this. Pertinently, this website offers an application both in English and Spanish, right? So it's translated across a few languages. And the key question here is, well, we have this beautiful website that's super useful. How do we actually get people to know that this website exists, right? And this is where online advertising comes in, where the idea is you might search for, how do I apply for SNAP? And hopefully something like this will come up and redirect you to getcalfresh.org. And the question that we came in with is, it seems like very few Spanish speakers are using this website, right? Because again, it's offered in the Spanish language. So as an example, each one of these dots is a different county in California. San Diego in particular, of the folks living under the poverty line, something like 50% are Hispanic and 23% specifically primarily speak Spanish, right? In contrast to that 23%, at baseline, we had about 8% of users of getcalfresh.org filling out these applications in Spanish. Right, so it seems like there's some sort of disconnect here where relatively fewer individuals are actually filling out this form on this website in Spanish. And so the question is, how do we pick a strategy to advertise such that we get an equitable distribution of SNAP applicants? And in particular, we're going to look at English and Spanish speakers. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this project is walk you through an experiment where we actually do run these Google ad campaigns from the GetCalFresh account from Code for America. We do a bit of modeling for Pareto frontiers and then elicit preferences along those Pareto frontiers. And then we'll talk a bit about the different preferences that we found across demographics for different distributions of how you actually want to advertise to SNAP applicants. Okay, so a bit of background. How does Google show you an ad? Folks here are surely familiar, but just in case, let's say that you want to search CalFresh, how to get food stamps. We end up at this landing page, so this is an impression. This second ad is us, so let's say that we click on it. So that allows us to get to this landing page. And what we're calling a conversion is if you click apply now, you fill out the whole form, which again should only take 10 minutes, and you actually hit submit. That's what we're calling a conversion, so a full application. This step is actually not too crazy because once you get to this step, it's an incredibly high number. Something like 95% of people actually do go through and fill out the whole form in that sitting. Okay, so with that context, what could go wrong? So there's a long literature on this, right? Starting from the LaTanya Sweeney era of crowding out leading to discrimination. So what does crowding out mean? The canonical example here that I have up is the idea that younger women are more expensive to advertise to. And so this means that if you're broadly advertising at a fixed CPC, you end up only showing your STEM career ads to the cheaper conversions, which are men and not women. So the question here is, do we see something kind of similar for Spanish speakers relative to English speakers? So what we do is we run some ad campaigns. We are going to look specifically just at San Diego County, which, as I mentioned before, is about 23% Spanish speakers under the poverty line, which is a good proxy for whether you're eligible for SNAP. And then we're going to look at 2 of Google's default ad bidding mechanisms, and we're going to run 2 separate language campaigns. So what does that mean? We have one ad campaign that's just for English. So this means that we're going to have a list of keywords in English, so things like Get CalFresh, SNAP, how to apply for benefits, food stamps, et cetera. For those English language campaigns, not only do we have English language keywords, we also ensure that the browser language settings are in English. And then we're going to have basically the exact same set of things, but in Spanish, right? So all of those keywords translated over to Spanish, as well as a browser settings in Spanish as well. Okay, so 2 separate campaigns, running this all in San Diego. And what we find at a high level is that Spanish ads do, in fact, cost more. So depending on which specific bidding algorithm you use by default, either the trade-off is going to be about 1 Spanish speaker converted to 6 English speakers, or 1 to 3, right? So significantly more expensive. And gonna preempt any questions here for like, why does this happen? Short answer is we don't know. This is a black box. A few potential hypotheses. This could have to do with the kind of like spam classifier genre of concerns, right? Because a lot of these sorts of classifiers for quality end up dropping non-English languages and thinking that they're lower quality. Could be an issue with reserve pricing because relatively fewer people are searching for certain terms. And this also could have like nothing nefarious going on, right? It could just be supply and demand. It could be actually very reasonable that we have this sort of ratio. So we don't know why, but we do know that this ratio exists, which kind of begs the question of how does this relate to fairness, right? And so kind of stepping back a bit, given that we have a set advertising budget as the advertiser, Code for America, right, we can do a few different things. So on the one hand, we could choose not to enforce any sort of constraints for fairness. On the other hand, we could build them directly into our optimization, right? And of course, this gives us some sort of trade-off because on the one hand, we can have an inequitable distribution because we're just picking up kind of the cheapest conversions that we can get, which are going to be English-speaking. But in contrast, if we're only picking up the cheapest conversions, because we have a fixed budget, we get a lot more of them, right? Whereas in contrast, if we try and enforce a more equitable distribution, we end up in a situation where we have fewer total conversions because we're paying a bit more for the more expensive conversions, right? So to map this more closely onto our specific example, like I mentioned before, we had this initial state where we had about like 10% Spanish speakers in GitHub Fresh at baseline when we weren't doing anything special with our advertising mechanism. And we said something like 23% of individuals under the poverty line in San Diego are Spanish speakers. So it seems like those are kind of our two endpoints here that seem reasonable, but there is this open question of like where along the spectrum seems reasonable or preferred for you to want to allocate your ad budget. Okay. And we can map these onto kind of our fairness terms. Any questions so far? Does that all make sense?
It just seems like there's another layer of questions, which is sort of what is the counterfactual? I mean, maybe some populations are actually likely to find their way to the benefits through other means if we don't reach them with the ad versus other populations. So it's hard to know the sort of, to do this cost-benefit trade-off without knowing the counterfactual there.
That is absolutely true. There is a lot going on, not just offline with like community outreach workers who may disproportionately reach certain types of speakers, but also across platforms. So one thing I explicitly didn't mention is we're only looking at Google here, but Code for America also ran ads on Facebook, which kind of hilariously they used to target college students because, of course, that's the demographic that's on Facebook these days. And also they targeted older individuals on Bing. So there's like this whole broader spate of ecosystems through which you can advertise. So yes, this is very squarely just looking at the Google Ads ecosystem, which is the broadest and the one that Code for America is putting the most money into. But they don't have control over, for example, community outreach workers who might be able to reach different populations. So it's a great question. All of what we're going to be talking about in this particular set of results is going to be squarely focused on just Google Ads. So what we can directly have control over. Okay, so moving on then. All right, so next step, let's elicit preferences. And again, constrained within the set of Google Ads that we have control over. So what we're gonna do is first estimate the different outcomes from different bidding strategies. So let's say that we have our $400 daily budget. This is actually roughly what the daily budget was. And let's say that I put all $400 into just my English language campaign, right? So again, English language keywords, only looking at people who are hitting English language settings browsers. And so that gives us this particular set of, about 36 English language conversions and 3 Spanish conversions. Pointedly, we don't end up with 0 conversions here, right? Because there are always kind of things that happen in the real world. So things like you're on a public computer at the library, and so the browser settings are different. Or your child comes over and helps you fill out a form in the language that you're not primarily speaking. So this is why we don't see zeros on the cross diagonals, right? Cross diagonals meaning also if we put all $400 in the Spanish language ads, we're still going to see about 7 English conversions and not 0. And conversely, we'll see many more Spanish language conversions. And of course, we can do linear combinations of all of these things and get yet another kind of combination. Question?
How do you determine whether it's an English conversion according to the language where you fill out the form?
Yes, exactly. So when you fill out the form, we can see if you've toggled it into a different language. Yep. Great question. Yeah.
Just had a question about demographics. So you mentioned that in Google, you ask that people have their browser settings in Spanish.
Yep.
Do you have a sense of like age differences between people who have like because like I could imagine a lot of like Spanish speakers who just use like Chrome in English.
Yep.
And I guess where do those people get counted in this analysis?
I believe they still get counted. So I believe what we did was we did an or. So it was either searching in Spanish keywords or Spanish browser settings.
So that would be under Spanish conversion or Spanish targeting.
Yeah, so it would be under Spanish targeting, and then the application fill-out form is how we're counting conversions. Yeah.
I see.
The age question is actually really interesting because originally we were also thinking of looking by age and gender and not just English and Spanish. But it turns out that it was basically entirely noise. Like the Google imputed age buckets have almost no relevance to actual age, which we know from the application. So that was moot. But
does Google give you other kinds of like imputed information that differed across groups?
It's not that Google gives it. Well, I guess it is. Google gives it to you, but you can target by specific demographic groups, right? So you can target by like lower 50% income level is another bucket that you can target by, but we generally found that it was not exactly linked to the outcomes that we could see. All right. I'm not seeing any other questions. So point being, we can come up with this Pareto frontier, right? So x-axis, share of Spanish conversions, y-axis, total conversions. And now what we want to do is understand the human preferences over these outcomes. And so what we're going to do is basically just grab pairs and do pairwise comparisons of different points along this Pareto frontier. So we can ask if people prefer this dot or this dot or this dot, but obviously that's not parsable. So what we actually ask is, do you prefer option A or option B? So this is the kind of extreme comparison situation. So the two dots at the very ends of your Pareto frontier, where on one end you can say, I'm going to put 0% of my budget into the Spanish language ads, which gives us 39 applicants total, but only 8% are Spanish speaking. Or on the flip side, we can put 100% of our ad budget into Spanish language ads, which gives us 54% Spanish speakers, but fewer total, right? We can also look at kind of the slightly more bounded, but example that we started with, which is basically, do we want to get about 10% Spanish speakers, which is what's roughly currently happening, or do we want to set the ad budget so that we end up with roughly close to that idea of demographic parity of about 23% Spanish speakers in San Diego? Okay. And point being, like choosing between, like, do you prefer option A or option B is hard, right? There is no set correct answer to this. And so in that spirit, I'm going to force you all to vote. We are doing active learning today. OK, so audience participation. We have option A, which has 36 total applicants and 13% Spanish versus 34 applicants for option B, which is 18% Spanish. So it's literally just this decision of would you include one extra Spanish speaker at the cost of 2 English speakers. So who here prefers option A? Who here prefers option B? 23%. We're looking in San Diego. Who here is a non-respondent? The vast majority of people. No one wants to offend anyone. OK, but point being, right, like it's hard to force yourself to think about these choices, but this is what the advertisers actually have to do, right? Question.
Yeah, I wonder if you thought about option C, which is that you're equalizing the percent of people in each of these populations who are in poverty, who are given who are applicants.
We're equal. Sorry, say again?
Yeah,
so the people who are applicants.
Right. So instead of equalizing the percent of, like, okay, the same ratio of people applied as who are in the population, out of the subpopulations that are in poverty, the same ratio applied.
Right. So the 23% is the individuals who are in poverty.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for the clarification.
Yep. Sorry. Yeah. So just to restate that. So of the people in San Diego who are under the poverty line, which is generally the proxy for, like a rough proxy for eligibility, of that demographic, 50% are Hispanic overall and 23%. So like half of the Hispanics in San Diego who are under the poverty line are in fact primarily Spanish speakers. Yes. Oh, sorry, we need a mic.
Does that mean that almost everyone you reached with these ads who converted were in fact eligible?
So that is something that we, in fact, do not have visibility into because of this whole complicated pipeline, right? So what we can see is that they did in fact apply, right? But after that step, you then have to sign up for interviews, at which point there's a massive set of dropout, because what if the interview is at a time that you can't make? And after the interviews, you have to submit documents, which is another thing that caseworkers help with, because you have to figure out which documents you need. Like, doesn't matter if I don't have a passport, that sort of thing. Then you submit your documents, but maybe something bounces back, so then maybe you drop out there, et cetera, et cetera. So there's like this whole long pipeline. So it's kind of hard to actually track from what we can see from just the ads, because it's very much like a longer term process. Question.
So I know there's an infinite list of possible confounders, but I'll ask just about one because I'm curious about it. So could it be that Spanish speakers believe that if they fill the form in English, their chances of getting the benefits is higher? And that may also depend on which language they have seen in the ad.
That is a great question. So I've never asked anyone this question, so it could very well be true. But a lot of these government services are legally required to be available to you in multiple different languages. And so there is this precedent that you can fill out basically any of these government forms in Spanish or in Chinese or in English, for example, just a subset of languages, but you actually legally, in New York City, for example, everything does have to be offered to you in your original language. So there is some precedent, but I could very well believe that there is some idea that like it could hurt your chances. But again, this is just the first step in this longer term process. And a lot of caseworkers do primarily work with their clients in the language that the clients prefer. So a lot of the caseworkers that we've talked to do in fact conduct their sessions in Spanish, for example. So it's not clear to me that there would be like an obvious harm to it, but of course, it could very well be the case. Great question. I'm not seeing any more hands. So, okay, moving on, the last bit of this project. Okay, so what did we actually end up doing? We asked 1,000 people on Prolific the same sorts of questions that I just asked you. So like, between these two pictograms, do you prefer option A or option B? And in particular, there are two research questions that I want to kind of present the results to you for. So the first one is, which demographics prefer the most efficient allocation? So if we're thinking about the Pareto frontier, we're thinking about the leftmost thing that maximizes conversions. So in our particular example, it would be something along the lines of, do you prefer to put all of your funding into just English language conversions and not do some sort of reallocation to include more Spanish speakers? So what demographics prefer the most efficient allocation? The answer is kind of surprisingly no demographic of the individuals that we surveyed on Prolific actually, by majority point estimate, prefer that idea of the most efficient allocation, which is kind of surprising, right? So of every single demographic that we could look at, this is Mr. P multi-level regression post-stratification on the y-axis. Right, we're not seeing any point estimates that are majority preferring this idea of this maximally efficient, only advertised to the cheapest possible conversions, which is kind of surprising. And the panel that I'm going to flag here is on party identity. So this is both where we see the particular demographic that is closest to that 50% mark, so the Republican demographic. And this is also the facet where we see the biggest difference between demographics across the board, so between Democrats and Republicans who have the maximally different kind of set of preferences. So looking a bit further into that, which allocation do people actually prefer? And so here now we're going to look at win rates instead on the y-axis. So again, on the x-axis, we're going to have each of our individual x's along the Pareto frontier, so our share of Spanish conversions. If we wanted to be maximally efficient, we would choose the option here on the leftmost side. And our win rate is just saying in our head-to-head comparisons, in our pairwise comparisons that involve this particular allocation, how often does it win in these pairwise comparisons? And so we can see from the leftmost points that this is just kind of confirming what we saw in the previous chart, right? Which is that Republicans do in fact prefer this leftmost allocation more so than Democrats, right? This is exactly what we saw before. But the more interesting point is that if we actually look for where the maximum win rate is, for both Democrats and Republicans, you actually get much closer to this idea of demographic parity, right? So we're much closer to about 23%, regardless of our high or low trade-off, regardless of if you're a Democrat or a Republican. And so the main takeaway here is that across all demographic subgroups that we looked at, we do have point estimates that kind of indicate there is this preference for some amount of equity. We're not saying all like the most equitable or anything like that, but just some amount of equity over pure efficiency. And in particular, demographic parity does have the highest win rate, kind of surprisingly, for both US Democrats and Republicans. And I think this is especially powerful to think about in contrast to other kind of scenarios where we surveyed folks in this particular experiment. If you think about like the very low preference for things like affirmative action in schools or in the workplace, in contrast to the relative acceptance of this idea of what is effectively affirmative action in the context of like Google-generated online ads for Snap. So I think this is really important to think about. Of course, this isn't a one-to-one between online ads for Snap and affirmative action in schools, but it is interesting directionally to think about where we might kind of open the dialogue for these sorts of fairness conversations. And I want to close this section of the talk by talking a bit about like who are the humans, right? So we asked a bunch of people on Prolific. I ended up talking specifically about this kind of party identity disparity. But I think you could very reasonably ask, like, actually, shouldn't the people who you ask for the preferences of be like Spanish speakers or people who have received SNAP? And the short answer is we did, and there's like basically no difference, right? So like whether or not you receive SNAP, you have basically the same win rate curve. Whether or not you're a Spanish speaker, you have basically the same win rate curve. It's really just different for the Democrat-Republican dichotomy there. Yep.
Question. So if say I wanted to make sure that I converted equally on Spanish, and just in terms of like absolute numbers, how much would I have to increase the CalFresh budget? Like say I want to write a check to CalFresh to say, I want to equalize these conversions and just give you money to have that happen, given that Spanish speakers are more expensive. Like order of magnitude, do I have to spend like $1 million, $2 million, $20 million?
I don't have that number off the top of my head. But I mean, like, if we're just thinking ratios, right, you would have to bump it up significantly, right? So, like, within your $400, you would have to increase it.
Do you have a sense of, like, how much do they spend on ads per year?
Per year, I'm not sure. So this is very specific. So I mentioned it's, like, about $400 daily budget just in San Diego. So that's just one county.
$400 a day in San Diego.
Yeah. And this was during that particular ad year.
What?
Because this was like right around it was closer to the rollout, so there was more of a push to get the advertising out there. And hopefully at this point, more offices are aware of this website, so caseworkers can also help and do that redirection.
What fraction go to the website without the ad, just, through search?
That's a good question. I don't have that number off the top of my head. It's a good question. I see John and then Irene.
Sorry, everyone's everywhere with microphones. Okay, I was wondering if, like, on the gap between percent that supported equitable allocations for SNAP versus supported affirmative action, if that's about SNAP versus affirmative action, or if someone had done this extended exercise, kind of active learning exercise with people about affirmative action and said, here's a picture, and I could hire these people or those people, and if you had invested them in the affirmative action question this deeply, how much do you think that number would have come up toward? Like, is it about concreteness or is it about the substance of the domain?
Right, it's a good question. I don't have the answer to that, but just like fully hypothesizing, I think there are two things. One is that some of these domains are so much more directly politically charged, right? So the idea of affirmative action in schools is like a thing that is a party talking point, as is the set of SNAP benefits, but A, they affect so many more people, and B, the idea of like looking at the ad allocation of it is like one step removed. So I think people feel less strongly about that as kind of a knee-jerk reaction. And then the other point is that it does feel a little less zero-sum. I think there is this knee-jerk of like, with affirmative action, if they get in, I don't get in. So there is this kind of idea. Whereas for SNAP, I don't think that's the case, and I don't think it's generally viewed as the case where like if they get SNAP, then I don't get SNAP, right? Because there is a whole process by which you apply, and there are these different constraints. So those are my two hypotheses, but happy to hear competing hypotheses.
Thanks.
So I will offer a competing hypothesis.
Incredible.
I'm curious if you think, my intuition is that the question you asked was more about outreach, whereas the question about affirmative action is more about like, when when we talk about a program, there's letting people know about the program, and then there's who actually gets to participate in the program. So I'm wondering if some of the, like, anecdotally, I think often I've seen people want representative outreach, but then sort of quote unquote merit-based being selected for the program. I'm wondering if you can comment on that as another potential hypothesis.
I think that's a great hypothesis. Yeah, so clear kind of examples related to schools as well. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, I guess maybe a related question is, like, is there anything on the literature distinguishing sort of people's, like, preference for representation in, like, the outreach stage, information stage versus, like, benefit receiving stage?
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm not sure if there is anything specifically on that in the literature, but I would believe it. Yeah, so that's roughly what I was getting at with, like, you're kind of one step removed from the direct question of, like, do you get the thing versus the online ads as, like, a proxy for this sort of outreach. No, exactly. All right. Okay, so to close out this section, no one asked, so I had this slide in case someone asked, because I was anticipating someone being like, but what if this is all just because Spanish speakers happened to be more expensive? What if it was in fact the inverse? And this is just saying that, in fact, if anything, we have, like, overestimated the preference for this avoiding maximal efficiency. So that slide is there in case anyone asked. But broadly speaking, to close out, what we did here was think about a framework to elicit fair allocations, and what we generally found was support for some amount of equity over pure efficiency. And I think this is really important, not just in the SNAP setting, even though that's what I'm talking about today, but more generally in different online ad settings. So we have examples that are really high stakes, from job placement ads to credit to housing ads, and these are the three I list because specifically Facebook has been sued for them. Point being, I think a lot more work needs to be done in the kind of fair ads space. Okay. That was the first half. I'll pause again for questions if anyone wants to chat more about this. All right, fantastic. So let's get into the second half. So here I'll be talking about LLMs for caseworker assistance on SNAP questions. And so, again, can't get out of active learning with me. So pop quiz, you are now a SNAP caseworker. Again, we're going to be in California for this, so we're working with the CalFresh program, if that matters for your opinion. You have a client who comes in, your client mentions that they received a cash gift from a family member. So how should this be classified in terms of income reporting? So in particular, you have to report your income, right, to determine if you're eligible for SNAP. You have to have, like, these very specific things filled out. So how much income do you report? I'm going to give you 4 multiple choice answers. A, it should be reported as income. B, it does not need to be reported because it's a gift. C, it should only be counted if it exceeds $1,000. And D, it can be reported, but specifically if you're going to use that gift for expenses. Okay, who thinks the answer is A? Thinks the answer is B? Thinks the answer is C? Oh, solid cluster over there. Who thinks the answer is D? Okay. So we... Not taxation. It's SNAP. So the correct answer is in fact A. So congrats to everyone in kind of like this cluster who voted for A. It seems very like location-based. And so your first thought with something like this is like, it seems like an LLM could maybe like help answer these questions, right? And chatbots do in fact seem pretty good. I copy-pasted this question into ChatGPT. It gets A correct. But of course, I then re-asked it, and it then told me confidently that the answer was B and that A is not right, because that's not how excluded income is calculated, right? So pointedly, this kind of opens the broader question of, can we use chatbots to answer these sorts of high-stakes questions? And so we look at this question in collaboration with Nava, who is a fantastic PBC who works on a lot of these sorts of GovTech products. And what they did is they piloted a chatbot that's trained on SNAP policy documents. And so to be clear, there are these like tens of thousands of pages of policy documents that, again, are kind of legalese, hard to read, that lay out in exact detail like how you should sort out all of these eligibility rules. And so if you ask this chatbot, right, the same question, my client received a cash gift, how should this be reported to CalFresh, you end up with both an answer from a standard LLM as well as based on a RAG model, right? So these verbatim citations that are clickable to specific policy documents. And so this all seems well and good, but of course we want to avoid the nightmare scenario, which is something like the New York City AI chatbot that was telling people to do illegal things. We don't want that. If you've been following the news cycle this week, this is in fact the same AI chatbot that Mamdani is going to kill and save money. So in contrast to this nightmare scenario, what we instead want to have is the sort of ideal scenario. So we have a client who comes in, and then either in person or on the phone, they ask, what kinds of income do I need to report for SNAP? And then the caseworker goes and uses all of the resources available to them, which could be Googling, which could be consulting the original policy documents, which could be asking ChatGPT themselves with their own private personal accounts, or using this Nava-made chatbot. They can figure out what the answer is using their existing set of tools, and then they can tell the client the answer. And so the research question that we want to ask is basically, does this chatbot help caseworkers answer questions? Right? Does this kind of make sense? Question. Sorry, do we need like a mic runner?
Sorry. It was a tentative question but I guess I was expecting when we got to this part that it would be about the client. I guess I maybe understand little about this space, but I would have thought that even if the rules here are complicated, the caseworker would be an expert. But you're saying that it's complicated enough that the caseworker actually doesn't know these things just by looking at the documents. They have to use external sources.
Fantastic question. That is exactly right. So two pieces here. First is when we're thinking about the idea of chatbots and this sort of thing, one of the key things that we want to keep in mind is safety, right? So we don't want, again, this kind of nightmare scenario where you're just having the client directly look at this chatbot and get incorrect information. So the caseworker serves as a really useful intermediary to basically make sure that there isn't any harm being passed directly to the client. On the caseworker side, so caseworkers vary a ton in what their experience is. Some of them specialize on homelessness services. Some of them specialize in CalFresh. Some of them specialize in youth services, right? And so because of this kind of broad set of clients that they work with, they don't necessarily always have expertise in every single thing. And again, like I mentioned, these policy documents are like tens of thousands of pages, and so no one has all of that memorized. And so they do indeed need to consult a bunch of external sources, and one of them primarily that I don't list here is actually slacking their colleagues. And so asking colleagues for help via Slack or email is something that about 45% of the caseworkers that we talked to did on a daily basis. So basically, short answer is, we consider them experts. They are definitely experts relative to the clients, but they are by no means all-knowing. Great question. Okay, and so this is now where I pull a bait and switch. So I told you all about this like incredible Nava chatbot, which works very well. So we did actually do a pilot study with them. Like we did pre-post survey, they did interviews. I'm not going to talk about any of that today. We are going to be talking instead about this offline experiment that is more generalizable and not specific to the Nava chatbot. So if you're curious, people did actually use this specific RAG model. They asked a lot about eligibility criteria, not very much about program comparisons, that sort of thing. Okay, so again, we're going to forget about the RAG model now and go into the question that we're going to be focusing on today, which is through this offline experiment that we ran, which just wants to know, do chatbots of varying accuracy levels help caseworkers? So the idea here is we recruited 125 caseworkers in Imagine LA, and we put some of them into a control group, some of them into a treatment group, and the treatment group gets to see specific chatbot responses when they see these different questions. And pertinently, these chatbots are going to vary in accuracy. So there are some that are going to be like pretty inaccurate and some that are going to be perfect. Okay? Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. Great question. The next 20 slides are going to go over this. They are about 10 slides from now, but stay tuned. Okay, so we have this set up, and then what we're actually going to do is, in particular, ask everyone some questions from a benchmark data set. So what everyone's going to see is specifically, effectively, a 45-question test. And so these are 45 multiple choice questions, very similar to the one that you had to do at the very beginning of this talk. And these 45 questions are drawn from a bank of 770 questions that we made overall. I say randomly, it's like randomly with caveats, so balanced on difficulty and that sort of thing. So how did we generate the 770 question data set? So Snap is a program with this like super robust quality control auditing component. So there are people whose actual job is QC auditor. They go through and look at all of the Snap data and see if people are making mistakes in giving people Snap or not giving people Snap based on eligibility. So like if people messed up the eligibility requirements. This is all public data, so you can actually get it. And our fantastic postdoc on the project, Jiawen Guo, has this Shiny app, link there, that allows you to visualize all the different errors that can come out of these QC data. And so this was our starting point. So we looked at the types of errors that were commonly made. We used that to then prompt GPT-4 to generate a bunch of realistic questions on the basis of these and policy documents. And then we refined them by hiring a bunch of actual Snap QC experts to go through and manually edit all of the questions and the answers, making sure that there was only one undoubtedly correct answer of the multiple choice answers, and making sure that all of the questions actually made sense. And again, were specifically pertinent to California, so CalFresh. So that's the set of benchmarks that we're working with. And again, we're basically going to show everyone their little 45 question exams. Because we want to test the efficacy of these chatbots kind of in the context of use, i.e. when they're being used by an actual caseworker, which is how they would be used in the real world, as opposed to kind of what I think of the standard audit, which might be like, we made these 770 questions, let's just plug it into a chatbot and calculate how accurate it is, just because that's not necessarily how it's going to be used in the real world. Okay, so now getting to Honky's question. Okay, so how are we varying the accuracy? We are simulating it entirely. For each question in our data set, we're going to have a correct answer and an incorrect answer. So let's say that we have this question, the client claims a deduction for transportation costs incurred while traveling to a medical appointment. Is this deduction valid? I'm not going to force you to guess what the correct answer is. So this is one of our chatbot responses. This one says transportation costs for medical appointments are considered part of medical expenses and can be deducted. This answer is in fact correct. The correct answer was D. And this particular answer is generated either by GPT-4o or 4o mini by us separately, but using the same system prompt as the Nava chatbot. Okay, so we have a correct answer that we can generate ourselves. And we can also similarly just like keep going with a range of temperature settings on 4o mini until we get an incorrect answer. And so this particular incorrect answer maps to A, which says they're not eligible. And so in this way, what we can do is across the 45 questions, we can just toggle at the question level whether we show someone an incorrect answer or a correct answer, and an aggregate that allows us to vary the overall accuracy across the 45 questions. Right? So we can show someone like 25 incorrect answers and 20 correct ones, and that gives them an overall 25 out of 45 correct. Yep, 2 questions.
What about, so these questions, these answers are not just A, B, C, or D?
Correct.
Presumably that has impact on how the...
Presumably it does. So the idea is we want to give them something that is similar to what a chatbot would actually give you if you were asking a free text question in the real world. We don't want the chatbot to just say an answer, because then you don't really have to actually read and think about the answer. You just plug in the answer, right? So you do actually have to read this, think about it, decide for yourself if you think it's correct. Yeah, so that is intentional. Great question. Yeah.
Both examples you gave, I would imagine there is like a specific part in the 10,000 whatever manual that explains what they should do that gives the answer. So it's very different from like previous examples where we saw where like doctors, there's no book that that chatbot can point to and tell you here's the right answer for the case. Wouldn't it make a significant difference if in this setting, because you can just point to it and then like 90 whatever % of the cases probably they could tell if it's right or wrong?
It's a great question. I think I would slightly disagree with your premise. I think it's actually much more similar to this medical example. So policy documents will have specific rules, but if you're a person for whom like multiple rules apply to you, like you need to combine different rules from different portions. Maybe one nullifies the other, but then you need a third policy source to say which one takes precedence, right? So it's much messier than just pulling a specific paragraph out of the policy document and saying this universally applies to this question, just because it's so context dependent. Any other questions? Okay, great. So I see no one spent the time during the questions to read the answer more thoroughly, because if you did, you would say something like, how would the chatbot possibly know that the client receives SSI? And that's the reason for this being incorrect. And the answer is because we actually give a set of client attributes to both the participants in our study and also the chatbots. So these client attributes are shown when we're generating the correct and incorrect answers from 4.0 or 4.0 mini. And in particular, this is important because client attributes can, in fact, change the answer. So in this particular case, right, if you're a senior and receive SSI, the answer was, in fact, D. But if you were not receiving SSI and thereby under 65, possibly, right, the correct answer is actually A. So these sorts of things matter. And so to bring this back to, again, what our experiment design is, we have our caseworkers, we have a control group and treatment group, but our control group specifically only sees client attributes and question and the multiple choice answers. And in contrast, our treatment group sees client attributes, question, and then this sort of set of chatbot answers, and then the multiple choice questions to click.
Do they know that the chatbot could be lying to them? Do they
Great
know
question.
that chatbot is wrong?
Do they know the chatbot could be lying to them? They don't. We do say in like the very long like consent form, like this chatbot may not be reflective of everything. It may not be 100% accurate. We don't know if people read that. But no, so not only do they not know how accurate the chatbot is or whether it could be inaccurate, they also don't know that it's a live chatbot. But we do simulate, I'm just gonna play this and then I'll take that question. But we do simulate it. And so this was the work of our fantastic student, Jenna Goshek. So this is what it actually looks like live in the Qualtrics form. So it does actually seem a little bit more like it's a live chatbot. Okay, question?
Do they have like internet like a real caseworker would in a real live situation that they can verify or have access to Slack or whatever? Like, is it really simulating a real setting?
Great question. Okay, so the short answer is we tell them to try and not use any resources. However, it's not clear to us if people actually follow instructions. From what we can tell, we think people at least weren't slacking their colleagues about this exam, because we did explicitly in email instructions tell people not to talk to their coworkers about the exam. But we can't stop them from Googling. We think they probably didn't, just based on the amount of time that they spent answering each question, which I'll get to in a bit. So in theory, they aren't using external resources, so this isn't the marginal effect of the chatbot on top of everything else. In theory, this is like the pure chatbot or no chatbot, but we can't control everything. Great question.
And just to clarify, the correct answer for the example you gave would be the one that does take into account the context correctly.
Yes, correct. So,
Okay.
so you do have to actually read the client attributes and interpret correctly based on the client attributes. Yep.
Amazing, thank you.
Yep.
I think we have one more question. Thanks. Hi. This might be a bit vague, but have you considered whether there are possible changes to the law or the codex and the way it's parsed or phrased that would be more amenable for chatbots? I mean, another work from the policy side rather than matching the bot to the policy.
It's a great question. How about I table that for the last slide, because that's basically what I touch on. So, okay, I'll get back to that, I promise. Okay, so with the time that we have left, I wanna get into findings. So first off, chatbots do have a significant effect on what the caseworker actually does downstream, but it doesn't actually reduce the time it takes to answer questions. So what does this mean? If we have a correct LLM suggestion, we end up increasing caseworker accuracy by quite a lot, by about 35 percentage points. In contrast, if we have an incorrect LLM suggestion, we decrease accuracy by quite a lot. And yep. Oh, sorry, we need a mic runner.
Just make sure I'm reading the plot right.
Yep.
So an unassisted caseworker is right on like 38% of the time?
Great question. I was hoping to skip past that. So the actual number, which I will show in like roughly five slides from now, it's about 50% of the time. So if you're looking at your full 45 question benchmark, the accuracy on average across caseworkers for that is going to be about 50%. This number is slightly different because we are restricting the set of questions. So first of all, we're looking at the question level accuracy, not the exam level accuracy on the y-axis. And also we're restricting to questions that had both a correct and incorrect LLM suggestion. So there was a set of questions, going to Hoggy's question earlier about like, how do you actually generate the incorrect ones? Some questions are just like too easy, and the chatbot will always get them right. And so we can't actually do this comparison on those questions. So this is the subset of questions that basically are kind of hard because the chatbot has to be able to get them wrong because we're subsetting to the set of questions where the LLM can get it wrong, but also can get it right. So this is kind of like the murky in between. So on the set of harder questions, the control group is doing quite poorly, 38%. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Mike.
How does like the distribution of questions on the quiz sort of look like relative to the set of questions that caseworkers ask the bot? Or I guess I don't know if you were able to look at that.
I have a slide on this in like 10 slides. Sorry. I'm gonna, okay, in the interest of time, I'll keep skimming through results, but I promise I'll get to that. And part of that does have to do with classifying these questions as easy, medium, or hard. And so again, we can see this effect where incorrect LLM suggestions decrease relative to the control group. And then on the right, these pink bars, correct LLM suggestions increase performance, but disproportionately so on hard questions, which kind of makes sense, right? Just because if you have something that you would do poorly on in just the unassisted control group, the benefits are disproportionately good for hard questions, but disproportionately bad for incorrect suggestions on easy questions, because it seems like people are really second guessing themselves. Great question. I'll repeat the question. How do you decide if they're easy, medium, or hard? Two separate ways. Originally, we had our QC experts actually label questions as easy, medium, or hard. Then we looked at the control group responses, so the accuracy levels by question. We clustered them based on those accuracy levels into 3 clusters. And so those are the ones we actually use in these plots. We looked at the correlation between the original labeling and the clustered labeling. Pretty high correlation. Basically, the only difference is easy ones stayed easy ones stayed easy, hard ones stayed hard, and then the medium kind of had some set that were easy or hard that got split. But yeah, that's how we distributed those questions. And we used the initial set of questions to roughly distribute, so all of the 45 question exams had about 15 medium, 15 hard, 15 easy. Okay. Next finding, question duration didn't really seem to change, regardless of whether you have a correct or incorrect LLM or just in the control group. No real difference there in terms of time taken on medium time per question. But of course, what we do see is this decrease over time where people's attention kind of goes away over time. So this is all expected. So next high-level finding is that better chatbots do correspond to better caseworker performance, but up to a point. And so this is getting closer to what John was asking about before, right? So like actually the control group does about 50% on the underlying surveys in aggregate. But with chatbot assistance, you end up increasing this overall effect by about 21 percentage points. And we can split this out by quality of chatbot. So lowish chatbots don't really do much, but if you're in the medium or high accuracy chatbot, that can assist a lot. Question? Oh, sorry, can we, mic runner?
This is super cool. I have a question. Do you have a plot for performance across time? Like, did caseworkers learn over time they should trust this chatbot more or less, or
Great question.
was it on a pattern?
So we do have that plot. It was like not particularly interesting. Also because we shuffled the ordering of questions as well. So like easy, medium, and hard were kind of interspersed. So we didn't see anything interesting on that front in terms of learning effects. But I'll talk a bit more about what effects we did see over time.
And then on the other side of that, do you have a sense of like whether caseworkers were sort of like using this to like reduce mental load and maybe wouldn't have to think through things, or whether they are learning a lot in the process?
Okay, so I don't have that answer in these slides, but pulling from the separate pilot study that we ran, the short version is in the actual surveys, they don't really report a reduction in administrative burdens, which was our kind of main hypothesis going in, is that this would save them a ton of time, and it did not seem to do that statistically significantly.
And then they also didn't say like, oh, wow, I learned so much, or...
they seem to like the chatbot. Like a lot of them were like, chatbots seem incredibly helpful, like on the Likert scale. And it's like, well, okay, it's not inconsistent. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm gonna keep powering forward. Okay, so what we have here is a plot that I'm going to show you that more granularly looks at chatbot accuracy across the X's, right? So this is, again, if we're toggling how many out of 45 questions see a correct LLM suggestion. And y-axis is going to be caseworker accuracy. So on that 45-question exam, how well does the caseworker do? And so in theory, if the humans were to just automatically accept what the chatbot says, you would see a y equals x line, right? So that's just y equals x in the purple line. And again, our control group is around 50%, right? So this is the line that John called out. So this is our kind of baseline for how we should be able to do. And it turns out that humans with AI can do better than their control group, right? So they're not fully reaching the kind of y equals x line, but we're seeing something like this. But pertinently, accuracy only increases up to a point, right? So like we have this funny situation going on towards the end where the chatbot is like super, super accurate, but you have this kind of plateau effect after about 80%, where the humans are basically saying, I think I want to disagree with the chatbot, right? And so this is kind of consistent with what the participants themselves reported. So they did self-report taking the chatbot answer about 70% of the time. We also asked them how accurate they perceived the chatbot. So in aggregate, I believe they thought that the chatbot was on average 80% accurate across everyone. And their perceived accuracy was essentially uncorrelated, like 0.13 correlation with the actual accuracy that they specifically saw. And so we think there are potentially trust issues here, right? So like the main thing that we can actually see is participants who thought the chatbot was really helpful were more likely to accept their responses. And going a bit to Kate's question from before, the one thing that we did see is that over time, the only thing that was predictive of whether people would accept chatbot answers in the future is if they were more likely to accept chatbot answers in the past. So if there's just someone who accepts chatbot answers, they will continue to do that. So that's the main kind of like over the course of the exam effects that we saw. And so this leads to our ongoing experiment, which is basically saying, well, policy documents, right? Maybe we can just pull out some links from that. So what if we basically go back to some sort of RAG model where we have clickable sources and citations? So new results, hot off the press. This is, again, our control group in this new experiment where we see about 55%, so very similar to last time in caseworker accuracy. Incorrect suggestions with citations actually help, right? So if the caseworker sees an incorrect LLM suggestion, but like seems like something's kind of fishy, it clicks on the citation, they can see, oh, in fact, this LLM suggestion is wrong. They do a lot better than in the case without citations, right? So it does seem like citations are good, but we see basically no effect when the LLM is correct, right? So no increase in accuracy, no increase in trust at the higher ends. And so the main thought here is we still have this sort of open question on the right side, even though it seems like we can kind of mitigate what's going on the left here with additional citations.
Allison, can you go really quickly back one slide? Yeah. So ideally, we would see that the incorrect LLM suggestion with citations would like go back up to the control or higher, right?
Right.
Like you'd see the citation and be like, ooh, the summary's wrong, but the citation gives me insight.
Right.
Okay, cool. Just want to make sure.
Ideally, you want the right side purple bar to be, or right side pink bar to be higher than left side pink bar. Yeah.
I was going to ask about the next one. So even qualitatively, was there someone who became like a huge power user and it's like their accuracy like shot up to 100, or someone who went to 0? Like across caseworkers, did you see? I know there's not that many people, so it's hard to like get any kind of real signal. But like, was there?
So it is true that people are pretty bimodal. Like you do end up with power users. One of the main issues that we had on this end actually was there were always like 1 or 2 caseworkers who were in the 100% group who had like 20% accuracy. We're not sure what's going on with them, but if anything, it's kind of outliers that might be dragging down that end.
Question of motivation, probably.
Yeah, well, they are being paid $100 and being told that, they're finding this out through work, and so we're hoping that they're viewing this as basically like a professional development experience. Yeah, so hopefully it's motivating. Okay, interest of time, final set of findings. So you may recall that this is nominally an algorithmic fairness seminar talk, and so in theory, maybe there is some effect by different attributes. And the short version is we found null effects across the board, which was surprising to me. So it is true that questions like the example that we walked through that depend on client attributes, so like whether or not you're elderly or on SSI, those questions are harder. So what we do see is that the yellow bars are lower than the purple bars in all cases, which makes sense because people are just doing worse on questions that are harder. But if you look at the differences by attribute, they're basically equivalent. So purple and yellow bars look more or less the same, regardless of if the client attributes are for seniors or non-seniors, female or male, et cetera. We also didn't see huge differences based on caseworker attributes. So caseworkers, here we have them binned into more or less than 3 years of experience. No significant effects there. We can look at caseworkers who self-report their usage of chatbots personally in their personal lives, and there's, again, no huge difference there in terms of how much they use chatbots on their own. And so to wrap up, chatbots can help, but more work needs to be done, especially on trust and generalizability. And I just want to make very, very clear, we do not recommend replacing caseworkers with chatbots. Caseworkers are so, so important. They provide so much value, not just in answering these specific questions, but also in holistically providing help for clients empathetically. And including the chatbot could improve their care to the client, but definitely they are irreplaceable. So going now to the generalizability bit. This is kind of my hope to address all of the various questions that came by that I was like 10 slides from now, I'll answer them. Okay, so how comparable is our benchmark to actual questions? The majority of caseworkers that we surveyed actually only run into questions in the wild, like in their work irrelevant to the survey, that they don't know the answers to on the frequency of monthly. So relatively fewer respondents to the survey would say weekly or less than weekly for how often they run into questions where they don't know the answer. So for the most part, they do know the answers to the questions that they're getting from clients because they're relatively common questions. And our benchmark questions can skew difficult, right? This kind of makes sense given the control group got like 50% on their exams. But about 75% of the caseworkers found the questions that they got in their exams to be somewhat familiar, or very familiar. So those three Likert bins. Next question is how comparable are multiple choice questions to like what you would actually do in the real world, right? A very valid question is like, we know that multiple choice questions maybe are better for LLMs, but this isn't how people would actually use them. And so manual review from our pilot study does show that only about 5% of responses ended up being inaccurate. So that particular number is actually very comparable to how well models like GPT-4o do on our multiple choice questions kind of in the void. So performance on multiple choice and free text queries seem kind of comparable. All right, and now going to this question of, do our results hold over time when we have changes to policies over time? Maybe this is something where LLMs do well. So one example, HR1 has now gone into effect as of last week, which means we now have to update all of our benchmark questions that are affected by this, right? And so this could be a place where chatbots can have a benefit, but more realistically, I think there are issues with lag and updating information over time. And of course, this is a problem on the auditing end as well. Another piece about whether or not our results hold broadly is, the change in caseworkers over time. So this is from a few months ago when about 16% of caseworkers used chatbots daily, but presumably that number could have gone up or down, and more usage of chatbots could increase or decrease trust. So we're not sure how that could change effects over the long run. And lastly, again, this is just about California. California rules can be different from other not CalFresh SNAP eligibility rules. And so all sorts of questions would need to be rewritten and refined if we are looking to help do benchmarking for other states, which we are starting to look at now. And of course, if you want to expand out to similar studies, but for Medicaid, Medicare questions, that's all very much in this kind of similar vein. So I think it's really important to do longitudinal studies and continue this work over time. And again, just as a refresher, there's this whole pipeline. I only talked about the first two bits, but I think there's a lot more work that folks can do across the SNAP benefits pipeline. If you want reading and you're interested in the history of SNAP and administrative burdens, here are two books that I think are fantastic. So this is just an unsolicited recommendation for you. All right, And I will close by thanking my fantastic collaborators, especially Jenna Goshak, my student, who spent much of yesterday making a lot of these plots for this talk, and Eric Janella, who has been on both of these projects between both Code for America and fostering our collaboration with NAVA. All right, thanks so much, everyone.